I'm Daniel Bass, manager of the South Asia program at Cornell University.
And I'm Shavin Senavaratner, graduate student in architecture at Cornell and student worker at South Asia program. You're listening to the Next Monsoon podcast, where we examine how art and culture can help us navigate the uncertain future. This podcast is part of a bigger project in the South Asia program at Cornell University. We'll be interviewing scholars from around the world to help us understand how people and artists face climate change.
In today's episode, we are excited to take you on a new journey as we shift our focus towards the tea plantation industry and climate change.
Sarah Besky is a cultural anthropologist. She is an associate professor in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. Sarah has researched the Indian tea industry for over 15 years, both in the tea estates of Darjeeling and the auction houses of Kolkata. Her research uses ethnographic and historical methods to study inequality, nature, and capitalism.
Welcome to the Next Monsoon, Sarah Besky.
Thanks so much for having me.
What's your first thought when you hear the word monsoon?
Honestly, it's mold, but that's that's just maybe because mold, which is a real issue, actually, I have to say, when you're living in the hills. But the other kind of thing, right, that I think about when I go to the hills, right, is kind of the everyday kind of work of just getting around and getting by, right, which is getting harder and harder and harder. Because quite literally, the hills are kind of sliding down the mountain with kind of each monsoon, which is really kind of an exploding tourism industry, whereby, right, the cities are getting hotter. And moister and gnarlier during the hot months of the monsoon, and people are escaping, right, because they're a little like there's more disposable income to do that escaping, and they escape to the hills, and that puts remarkable pressure on infrastructure. At the same time, the people I work with, right, in the Darjeeling Hills, right, so I've been working on the plantations for a long time, and my new work is actually outside of the plantations in this kind of agricultural enclave on the India-Bhutan border, but again, still kind of this mountainous Himalayan foothill type landscape. At the same time, right, during the rains, right, many of the people, or kind of during all year, many of the people that I work with, especially the youth, are leaving the hills to go and find jobs in restaurants and as drivers or and whatnot. So when I think about the monsoon or a monsoon, any monsoon, the upcoming monsoon, perhaps the next one, right? It's about these kind of flows, right, that are like literally wearing down in a real material way. The soil, the roads, the infrastructure, the livelihoods, lives of the people that I work with up in the mountains.
What inspired you to be part of this project on the Next Monsoon?
What, exciting about this project, there's the potential to kind of thinking about, the climate change in South Asia is, to kind of bring, perspectives from the humanities to bear on what are kind of quite overdetermined by science, by scientific knowledge, right? So again, landslides are a great example. Every monsoon, geologists and kind of, right, flannel-clad men with sensors and various data-driven devices, come to, measure this and focus. And like, that's awesome, important work. But what I think is actually super interesting are the stories that people tell about those men with sensors and like, what are they doing? What kind of knowledge is it? And how do we kind of take the stories and the questions about this kind of very precarious future, about living in South Asia in the context of climate change, right? Drought, stories that we all see now regularly in the newspaper, droughts, floods, rains when there shouldn't be, rains when not raining when it should happen. These are these kind of everyday, these kind of very, quotidian occurrences now.
How has your background and training as a cultural anthropologist shaped your view on climate change?
What I kind of gravitate towards first in terms of questions is how did we come to be in this kind of particular moment, and what does it mean? And to kind of ask those about climate change, right? The experience of climate change. Anthropology is the kind of the attention to, the everyday, attention to narratives that often, are seemingly unimportant.
So you've been doing research in the Darjeeling Hills on the tea plantations and now just outside them for many years. And I was just wondering, what changes have you seen over that span of time, especially in relation to climate change, the relationship between people and the environment?
Yeah, I mean, back to, the question about kind of thinking about anthropology and climate change, right? I don't kind of take, the environment or climate as this kind of bounded category. Like to me, climate change is an economic problem, it's a social problem, it's a political problem, right? It's like this tentacular mess, right? And it's a real mess. Things that I've seen, right, over the last, many years of kind of working in the, in the tea industry, right? So first, like, and foremost, like Darjeeling is like this super, often like, famed bourgeois, like super luxurious kind of form of tea, production. So you
Hmm.
would think that like workers would like make money in, right? They would be paid, right, in tandem or like in congruence with that fame and fortune. However, that is like absolutely not the case, right? And despite, right, in the last kind of 20 years, really, right, more attention to social sustainability and all sorts of other forms of verifications and certifications, right,
Hmm.
nothing has made workers' lives materially better. These plantations are actually not as quote unquote productive as they maybe once were, right? The bushes are old, the rains are super erratic, right? This is changing like the kind of economics of the industry, right? Because at least in Darjeeling, plantations kind of make pretty much all of their money on what's called the first and second flush, right? So the kind of early season when, the kind of weather kind of turns a little warmer, when there's a little bit of a drizzle in the air, right before the monsoon comes, right? The monsoon is actually when the price drops and you're just kind of producing bulk. And you're pretty much just, as a plantation, right, trying to just move that material through the market as fast and as efficiently as possible. When I think about climate change, I think about climate change as a problem of work, where we see kind of a move from production to reproduction, whereby, right, in order to kind of make ends meet, plantation workers and non-plantation workers are, say, turning to homestay tourism as a means of making a living. They're certainly turning to migration, but that's long been a livelihood strategy here. And right, like, and where, climate migration is very much a thing, and across, obviously South Asia. So, in I mean, I'm not, like these kind of, oh, the industry is kind of collapsing, can often be kind of an apology for really bad plantation management. And I don't
Hmm.
want to kind of do that. But there is a real there's a real kind of ecological kind of conundrum of the plantation. First, like, should there be plantations at all? I would argue no, like like
Yeah.
reform, land reform. However, with the plantations as they are now, kind of 150 years, just kind of like fixed into this landscape, right? They're an economic and ecological problem. But again, back to these kind of questions of landslides, right? What I think is actually the most vexing, dystopian, like fill in the blank kind of word that kind of signals doom, to rip these bushes up, these tea bushes up because of the root structure would actually, according to some scientists, exacerbate landslides, not prevent them. So in a real way, the tea, the plantation, is something that people are stuck with. Despite the fact that it's not something that many people can, make a living, like at least it supports their children in the way that they want their children to be supported, and so on and so forth.
I'd like you to step back for a moment and take us on the journey. How do you get up to the plantations? Like, what's the way, the methods of transportation and the elevation to give our listeners a sense of, the space that you're talking about?
Okay, sure. Right, so it's not a quick, like, driving to the Syracuse airport kind of a, jaunt.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's an airport at the kind of essentially the base of the mountains in this kind of border town of Siliguri. And then, right, normally it's like a four-ish, and it's getting longer. It's a four-ish hour drive up the mountain. And it's getting longer because of those landslides, because the roads keep washing out. Because there's only a couple roads that from,
Hmm.
the plains kind of traverse up the mountain. And like, maybe you've been on like one of these like kind of zigzag kind of roads before, but like that's like how it is for 4 hours, right? And you're kind of, you kind of hug the ridge, and so kind of on either side, depending on where you are kind of in your drive, right, kind of the hills kind of plummet off from the road. And often if you're driving up to Darjeeling, right, not if you're driving, so there's kind of two roads, right? You go up to Darjeeling, you go up to Kalimpong, which is, this, food producing landscape. Go up to Darjeeling, it's pretty much blanketed with tea. So, and tea is actually quite striking as a landscape, right? It looks so neat and orderly. These like bright green bushes, especially
Hmm.
kind of if you're driving, say, in the monsoon,
Yeah.
and it's not super cloudy that day, right? These like little topiaries, right? They're all groomed and these little like so it's a striking green landscape, and kind of these bushes cling to the hillside, the houses cling to the
Yeah.
hillside, right? You're probably kind of like zigging in and out of the path of what is known as the toy train, this like little narrow gauge locomotive that has kind of plied the same road that the cars do, since the late 1800s,
Hmm.
originally to kind of bring kind of some supplies up, but to bring tea down. And so that's this winding journey that brings you, after many hours to the town of Darjeeling, which is this, town perched on a ridge,
Hmm.
again, surrounded by plantations. So yeah, so for some it's quite, nauseating, and for
Yeah.
others it's quite beautiful, or some combination between the two.
What is it like for a worker working in a tea plantation, and what are the social hierarchies that are also built over time?
Oh wow, yeah, no, like great question. Where do I start? Like the hierarchies go every which way. Structure upon discrimination, upon entrenched racialized hierarchies, entrenched gendered hierarchies, entrenched geographically molded hierarchies. But anyway, kind of working out from the plantation, there's labor and there's management, and there's also, at least in the Darjeeling plantations, quite gendered division of labor. In Darjeeling, it's still all done by hand, right? So all of that hand plucking is done by women. All of the kind of hand pruning, right, which is done kind of actually right around February, that's all done by women. But men, tend to kind of work on the machines in the factory, backpack spraying for pesticides. Also, the workforce is all Nepali, generally speaking, especially in Darjeeling, whereas the management, especially, and the ownership is generally not. There's these ethnic relationship on the plantation that, lay over contemporary India, but they also lay over the state of Bengal, where Nepalis are majority in the hills, but they are not in the state as a whole. So plantations that are maybe more one ethnic group or tribal group than another, because of the way that recruitment kind of worked.
You were mentioning about how women had to do the hand pruning in Darjeeling versus in South India, where it's more mechanized. Is there a reason why like hand pruning is associated with luxury, with handmade, handcraft?
I don't know if you've ever seen like these kind of colonial era kind of like tea images. Daniel could talk way more about this than I
Yeah.
can, about like kind of Lipton's, the Sri Lankan kind of like plantation industry, like
Hmm.
really kind of like, really like doubled down on this kind of aesthetic. Whereby the woman tea plucker kind of hands, right? The hand is this kind of part of that aesthetic. Like
Mm.
hands the like white, doily clad, British, tea drinker, at the like the
Yeah.
tea table, right? Like that kind of that image of the hand of hand delivery, of hand plucking, right? So it's not like, and then the kind of the other image, right, that the kind of, I think that it kind of dominates in tea advertising even today, right? And like absolutely today, like this has not gone away, is the kind of stooped and comely woman, right? Bowed over a bush, hands kind of atop it, right? Because it's all right. If you like kind of imagine a tea bush, right? Like women, like kind of are kind of grooming the top of that with their hands, and that like that image key to most kind of representations of tea. And so whether that's kind of connoting luxury, or perhaps tea itself, right, as a kind of something that makes tea legible as a consumer item.
Also, like how the people, the workers, are so tied to the landscape. What is a sick landscape, and what happens to the people?
I wrote a book about that too. This is great. This is like, so sick landscapes are this, really interesting kind of, concept, or sickness is really also importantly like not contained to the tea industry. But it is a kind of, term of art, right, that was deployed in, say, the Bombay mills, right? Nehru kind of like famously described them as sick, right? Sickness is an industrial kind of concept. And so kind of as, we were talking about with regards to kind of what are the effects of climate change on the tea industry with production going down, kind of yields of tea and yields of money going down. What more and more kind of tea plantations are doing is essentially when production is pretty much going down, the autumn flush is kind of almost over. Plantations kind of just like declare themselves sick, declare themselves closed, right? Right before they have to pay the puja bonuses. And then they open up right before the first flush is supposed to kind of come online. And right, and so when you're kind of when you self-declare yourself sick, it's akin to bankruptcy. It's not bankruptcy. It's saying it's like it. You don't have to pay workers, all those permanent workers who are supposed to be, maintaining the landscape. You have to pay them. Like, so they're just so none of that maintenance work is getting done. And then, workers are staying on the plantation because it could open any day. If everyone needs to report to work, lest you lose your job. And if you lose your job, you lose your house.
So this next monsoon project is about cultural responses to climate change. And some of the other people we interviewed are focusing on visual art, performance art, film. As an anthropologist, what are some of the cultural responses to climate change in your research that you've seen?
I don't have any art. Okay, so on.
You got culture. You may not have art, but you
I
got
got
culture.
culture. See, I got anthropologists have culture. So for me, what I'm kind of paying attention to, right, is this kind of move of, kind of tourists, right, like upper middle class tourists from, urban India into the hills to occupy the houses of Nepali and Lepcha and Bhutia families, right? And these are not hotels that are coming up, right, in the hills as a response to the heating of cities and the toxification of cities. These are homestays, right? And Mamata Banerjee, right, CM of West Bengal, is actively pushing homestays in two specific sites: the Darjeeling Hills and the Sundarbans, right? Two like acute sites of climate disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like kind of thinking about right how the kind of collapse of an agrarian economy has kind of created this move to the service economy, this move to kind of selling the home, right, to selling reproductive labor instead of productive labor, like a move to selling not rice, but like one's own home and one's own like rice that they have to cook, that they had to buy, that was brought up from Siliguri for these tourists who are also coming up from Siliguri. That is the kind of response, kind of quote unquote, that I want to kind of pay attention to, is in the homes, in the unremunerated work of especially women, but of families in the hills.
In this issue of homestays, I'm very curious because, at least in Sri Lanka, the homes of tea plantation workers, they don't own them. They don't have running water or electricity oftentimes. So, like, it would not be a place for tourists to stay. And the development is in, like, former planters' homes and other things that the estate
Mm-hmm.
owns have been converted into these kind of luxury getaways. But are you talking something much more affordable?
Mm-hmm. Much more affordable. And
Yeah.
yeah, and so on the plantations, right, there's this kind of on and off the plantation thing that's going on.
Oh, okay.
So like the bungalow tourism thing where you can like stay in a bungalow and like
Yeah.
sleep beside a tiger with its head still on it on the floor and like go for a butterfly hunt and picnic, like that whole like Raja or
Yeah.
fetish tourism, like that's been going on for like 20, 30 years. But some plantations, especially in the case of, a fair trade certified plantations, plantation management had been pushing homestays since I started my dissertation work in like 2006. That's how I was actually able to stay on plantations, like live in workers' houses, because there was already this like weird homestay thing that they were trying to pilot. And management took, kind of a huge chunk of the money that tourists were paying them tourists were paying to the, plantation, and like the management gives, the workers a little cut. So homestay tourism is one thing that's kind of, been kind of happening in bits and spurts on plantations. But just recently, there was an act passed in which 15% of plantation land in Darjeeling can be kind of converted to non-plantation purposes or non-tea purposes. So changing these plantation leases to kind of remove 15% of, the land under tea will mean a massive infrastructure building for tourism.
Since you are speaking to us from your sabbatical in Kolkata, what is your current research about?
What I'm working on right now is kind of an ethnography of the concept of settlement. Settlement is so much more than just that kind of land revenue system, right? Settlement is about kind of making place and people legible. It's about making place and people productive. And this was a massive colonial mega project, right? Not unlike the plantation. I'm kind of paying attention to kind of all of the reproductive labor, i.e., food production, right? That allow these other, projects to persist or exist and persist. And not unlike the plantation, right? These kind of what are called government estates, and there's thousands of government estates in Bengal, or thousand and change in Bengal. It's a kind of late colonial project that are kind of oriented to both revenue generation, i.e., through rent, and the relationship between like getting land rent up. Was this kind of massive project that enrolled scientists and enrolled colonial bureaucrats, agricultural scientists are doing at this time, like what crops should be planted, how should they be planted, and then, but in addition, like who should marry whom, like how can inheritance work, what do we do with all these widows? Like these are all kind of questions that the settlement officer kind of, answered.
How does all this work on settlement relate to climate change?
How do I stay settled on my land, right? Especially as agricultural kind of markets collapse, right? There is no market for local rice, say, anymore, really minimal market for local, things like corn. How do I stay in place, right? And this is a question like that is not unique to the hills, but it is a question of climate change kind of in multiple, what, like, are there rights to stay home, right? Are there rights to kind of occupy one's land and not be migrant workers, right? Farming is becoming increasingly not an option for people. Those are climate change induced kind of things, right? So settlement is a climate question, and as I kind of mentioned before, right, climate change to me is also a question of work. Like, what are the new forms of work that people have to do in order to keep a home, to provide for their children?
Do you have examples in mind of people being resilient against these issues that they have to face with climate change in South Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I worry also about and like I hear what you're saying. I worry about the rhetoric of resilience because it sounds too nice. It sounds too rosy. And so it's just like, I'm gonna flip your question a little bit, and like people are just everyone's just getting by. Is that resilience? I don't know. Like, is it making it to the next day? Like, making it to the next day is what I see. Like, making it like, you know, um like the like people like the folks that I work with in the villages, right, are leasing out their homes to tourism companies just so they can stay in their homes, right? Which is this really bizarre, like maybe like perhaps even TMI kind of detail for our purposes here, but like like they're entering into really like things that they're deeply troubled by in order to stay on their land. So yes, they're staying on their land. We call that resilience? People aren't like people themselves would not call that resilient, and therefore I push back against the language of resiliency. It's just like, how do people get by?
Is there any form of collective response or collective action that might be taking place in the hills?
I mean, most of the collective work, right, is often having to be directed to repairing landslides.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly upon occasion that's remunerated depending on where the landslide is, say a national highway or something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, because that like there's only a couple, right, arteries, as we talked about earlier. There's only a couple arteries like up to the hills, right, up to
Yeah.
these kind of towns and villages, right. So then, like, when they break down, it's a real huge problem, right? Because again, like, basic grains are not being produced in the hills anymore, right? Everything is like, all basic supplies are coming up from the plains to the hills, right? So
Mm-hmm.
shutting down these roads is really, it's dire. And so collective response, collective action, collective work is directed as moving as fast as possible with the minimal resources often directed to the hills to clear those landslides, knowing full well, and this is what I'm talking about with like why resilience is not what I want to kind of think about, is knowing they're repairing those roads, knowing full well that they're going to slide again, because they will. Right, because once they slide once, they're going to slide again, and like there's one road, it's a longer road, but it's a little bit, it's kind of the preferred route. It's my preferred route now because of how many kind of massive trucks are on the other road because of the hydropower installations on the Tista River. And it's just really depressing, like again, dystopian kind of trip up to the hills. But anyway, you can see these scars of where the landslides happened. And like, will it happen again tomorrow? Will it happen again in 3 years? Who knows, but it probably will happen again. And like that's been my experience working in the hills for, since I'm working on the plantations, and it's quite stark on the plantations, right? Because when
Hmm.
things are so neat and manicured and you see something drop a little bit, you're like, when is that going to go? Is it going to go tomorrow? Is it going to go in 3 years? It's going to go sometime. Just when is that happening?
An inspiring picture of life in the hills.
I say that, but I mean, it's more just like, so much of the imagery, right? Back
Yeah.
to your question about, smiling tea workers plucking tea and giving it to doily clad women in Europe. So much of the image of the hills are kind of smiling, ethnically, racialized, fetishized, feminized, this image of happiness, right? So much so that like the CM again, Mamata Banerjee, kind of, whenever a kind of development project kind of gets talked about in some kind of way, or maybe like something is promised in some, abstract fashion, right? She declares that the hills are smiling. And that's real rhetoric, because for many people, the hills are falling down.
Hmm.
I mean, like that's the hard thing about climate
Yeah.
disaster in these particularly kind of sensitive sites. It's like it's a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Right. And so, you organize collectively around one thing, right? You clear that one landslide,
Hmm.
Hmm.
and you knowing full well and talking about the fact that it will slide again. To kind of trade in the language of goods and bads has never really been my jam. Right. It's just profound ambivalence. It's really hard to talk about positives and negatives, certainly positives, right? When you're working with the people who as they're collectively organizing, talk about that inequality and talk
Hmm.
about those uneven feelings.
So, with all this in mind, kind of looking over everything, what are some of the goals and outcomes of this next monsoon project?
So, I mean, to me, I'm a process over product kind of person. And so
Hmm.
for me, like the process of kind of collective thought, collective deliberation, like getting people back into a room together after 3+ years of protracted isolation, like that to me is part of the goal to like, again, which is really weird for a climate conference, like very, I very much note that. However, right, that sense of repartee, that sense of like because it is such an interdisciplinary conversation. These are people who don't normally talk to each other, and I think that
Hmm.
that's really cool. To kind of get folks into a room where people are working on these kind of cultural responses, whatever that might mean, because right. So for some folks, right, that's a very specific kind of um, thing in the world, and for other
Yeah.
folks it's not, right, because everything's a cultural response, right? So but then what are cultural responses, what are climate, what is
Hmm.
climate change, what are, and then to kind of then move across not just disciplines but sites across South Asia to kind of think of where, which is this, particularly, like it's a site of climatic events, right, in
Yeah.
real and disturbing ways. And so like how can we kind of think together about this space and to use this space as that ground for collective thinking.
That's it for today's episode on the Next Monsoon. Next time, we'll be talking to Sunal Kular, with whom we'll have an in-depth conversation on the collective power of art in response to climate change.
We would like to give special thanks to Sam Lubowitz and Angelica Kramer at Cornell's Language Resource Center for their assistance with recording this podcast. Shivin Senavaratna not only co-hosts this podcast, but is also our editor. Funding for the podcast and the entire Next Monsoon project comes from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Please follow the South Asia program on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SAP Cornell. You've been listening to music by SAP Administrator Gloria Lemus Chavez and her partner Brandon Kane. Make sure to check out more of their work in the show notes.
The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast do not reflect those of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Cornell's Office of the Vice Provost for International Affairs, or any other official entity of Cornell University.
I'm Daniel Bass.
And I'm Shivin Senavaratna.
Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode for new conversations and stories on the Next Monsoon.